Thanks for joining, everyone. This is our TRISH Orbit Rendezvous for October. It is covering exploring metabolic manipulation for long-duration spaceflight. We will get started with some announcements first, and then we will get into the conversation. So, first announcement is for mostly TRISH investigators. We have a save the date for the 2025 NASA HRP Investigators Workshop. It is on January 28th through the 31st in 2025 in Galveston, just like last year. So make sure to register for that, and we're excited to see you there. And then the next thing is we currently have our 2025 postdoctoral fellowship solicitation open. The deadline is December 18th. And for those of you that don't know, our fellowship program supports early career scientists pursuing research with the potential to reduce health risks associated with spaceflight. Our selected fellows participate in our TRISH Academy of Bioastronautics and also receive a 2-year salary. And I'll actually let our moderator today, Dr. Jeff Willey, talk about what AOB is.
Hi, everyone. First of all, thank you for attending. Really look forward to today's discussion. The Academy of Bioastronautics is a fantastic opportunity for postdoctoral fellows and for individuals to learn about the primary risks to human health in space, while at the same time learning how to advance their careers in the space, life, and physical sciences, whether they're looking at academics, industry, government roles. We'll bring in content experts in all of those particular areas to talk about not just the science associated with performing that kind of work, but how to succeed as a professional in those different roles. And so I would invite all of you to take a look at the postdoctoral fellowship to apply. It's a great chance for mentorship, for learning, and for advancing your career.
Thanks, Jeff. Again, the deadline is December 18th, and we are also putting all of this information in the chat. So if you need the link to submit a proposal, it should be in there for you. All right, the next thing is TRISH has a couple of positions open. The first one is our Chief Scientific Officer, and our Executive Director, Dri Donaville, is actually going to talk a little bit about that.
Hi, everyone. We are looking for a unicorn. We're looking for somebody who is a phenomenal scientist, who has a lot of vision, who can work well with our team, be very agile, think big things and execute. And we have had this position open for a little while. Our chief scientist went to industry. Our last chief scientist went to industry in the summer, but we are looking for just the right person. And so if you have an interest, and we could put a link directly to the BCM portal on the chat as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Dri. And then the next position that TRISH has open right now is our Expand Program Lead, and I will let our Deputy Director, Jimmy Wu, talk a little bit about that one.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Madison. Yeah, so in addition to our Chief Scientific Officer position, we have the Expand Program Lead, where we're looking to have someone be able to lead our Expand program, which is one of the unique aspects of what we've been able to create here at TRISH to support biomedical research with the commercial astronauts, the private astronauts, and it's a really exciting program. And so we're continuing to look for the best candidates there to continue to do the work associated with Expand, but two, as we all know, the commercial spaceflight industry is growing, but we're also looking for someone with a vision to be able to match also the grand visions that a lot of these commercial companies have with regards to how we would keep their passengers healthy during their missions. So if you're interested, please apply. I'm sure the link for the application will also be placed in the chat. Thank you.
Thanks, Jimmy. And then the last one is our TRISH summer 2025 internships. We have two opportunities for undergraduate and graduate students. They are both paid positions. The first one is Expand, which is similar to what Jimmy was just talking about, except it's an internship, helping out with our Expand program. And then the second one is our TRISH Communications internship, and those interns get to work with me. If you have any students that are interested in space health, please share with them. Like I said, it's a paid opportunity, and it's actually a NASA internship. So that's really good for their resumes. All right, so we will go ahead and get started. I will say before we get started on the panel, if you have any questions, please utilize the Q&A feature instead of the chat. That is where we will be answering questions and getting questions to answer throughout the conversation. So I will let Dr. Jeff Willey take it away. He is our moderator today.
Thank you very much, Madison. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. I think we're going to have a fantastic discussion regarding metabolic manipulation during long-duration spaceflight. We have two excellent panelists, Dr. Kate Flickinger, Dr. Allyson Hindle, and we're going to be introducing them in just a second. So, just sort of as an introduction to the topic, metabolic manipulation, and I love this particular graphic that we have here with the hibernating bear on the spacecraft. Is one in which it could potentially serve as a countermeasure to protect against physiologic challenges or risks to human health caused by many of the hazards that are faced in the spaceflight environment. And we know that there's lots of hazards that astronauts are going to face during long-duration spaceflight, from certainly microgravity to radiation exposure outside of low Earth orbit. There's isolation. There's constraints regarding what we can take with us on these missions, be it food, be it pharmaceuticals, be it other resources. So we need to find countermeasures that can maintain human health in space. And metabolic manipulation is one potential approach for ensuring mission success on long-duration missions. So today we're going to have a discussion about what I consider a charismatic approach for maintaining human health, and that is metabolic manipulation. I call it charismatic because I think people are aware of things like hibernation. They can see it in culture, like as in scientific or science fiction movies or in novels. They're familiar with that. But there's a lot of misconceptions regarding metabolic manipulation. So today we're going to talk about the current state of the science, the feasibility of metabolic manipulation approaches. What are the constraints? What are the barriers to overcome? How can we align the engineers together with the scientists, the astronaut corps, and the administrators to make sure that we can get this done? So I'd like to briefly introduce our two expert panelists today who will be having a discussion on this particular topic. We're going to start with Dr. Allyson Hindle, who is an associate professor in the School of Life Sciences at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Allyson is an animal physiologist who studies how some animals can thrive in extreme environments while others cannot. And she's worked with a variety of mammals, from small hibernators to seals, as well as sea lions. Then Dr. Kate Flickinger is an exercise physiologist and a TRISH postdoctoral fellow, as well as an Academy of Bioastronautics member. And she's in the Department of Emergency Medicine at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. She is the principal physiologist managing the Applied Physiology Lab at her institution. And both of them are very actively involved in research and efforts related to metabolic manipulation. So we're going to start off the discussion by asking the panelists, we'll start with Dr. Hindle, to describe for us their thoughts on what exactly is metabolic manipulation, and perhaps a little bit about the current state of the science.
All right, thanks, Jeff, and thanks for having me on this discussion. I'm excited to do this. So I study the animal side of things. My research is focused on looking at animals that do interesting and extreme things and try to put that into context, put their strategies into context of what humans are good or less good at. biologically. So from my perspective, I think there's a wealth of natural information out there on how one can hibernate, even in mammals. There are a whole bunch of different strategies. I'm going to let Kate take a little bit more the state of the field on what's possible in humans. But my perspective on a lot of this is we should maybe look for nature solutions to see what our targets should be for human metabolic manipulation for the future.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Allyson. To kind of piggyback off of what you said, Allyson's work, Mother Nature has given us lots of examples of hibernating animals, everything from ground squirrels to bears to 13-line ground squirrels, tenrecs, even hummingbirds, examples of biology that we can use to derive whenever we're trying to think about how can we use this application in humans. And when we say human hibernation, there's a big, discussion over what we call this. Is it human hibernation? Is it torpor? So we refer to it as metabolic manipulation. This is not what you see in the sci-fi movies. We're not going to put people into pods and send them into space and have them sleep for months and months on end. But right now we're looking at ways to target specific metabolic pathways within human physiology to help reduce the reduce metabolism.
And I'm going to say one more thing before Jeff asks me a hard question that I don't know the answer to, that being able to target metabolic pathways for manipulation in humans, if we can do it, it solves literally all of the problems of long duration spaceflight. It reduces food consumption. It reduces other resources. It improves psychosocial dynamics. All of these things that we're worried about, it reduces potentially the strain on the human body. The human body is a machine. If you can work it a little bit less over a long duration mission, you have fewer opportunities for that body to get injured and then need potential other interventions. So maybe it's the same potential intervention, metabolic manipulation. Maybe we can get at all of these issues that we're worried about for humans over long duration travel in space.
Yeah, exactly. The metabolic manipulation can be applied to any of the 5 major risk factors related to spaceflight, even radiation. Hibernating animals have a higher tolerance and experience less damage when they're exposed to radiation. So there are lots of applications, and we're talking about humans. The payload is expensive. We don't need to reduce their core body temperature to 4 degrees Celsius. Can we even just reduce their temperature by 1 degree and gain even a 5, 10, 15% metabolic reduction, just to reduce the groceries that you have to pack for a trip to Mars? So even just a little bit of metabolic savings is very impactful.
One thing I think about when I hear this is, all right, so you mentioned that, it has the potential to serve as a countermeasure against radiation exposure. And, as somebody who does bone and musculoskeletal research, I'm somewhat aware of the work that's been done out there regarding hibernation in bears and protection against musculoskeletal deterioration, despite the fact that they're hibernating. So by reducing their metabolic rates. But what are your thoughts on countermeasures against other potential complications like altered team dynamics during long duration missions? Because you're going to have individuals that are confined in small areas potentially during that period of time.
Well, a slightly facetious answer would be that if you could go have a real long hibernation nap and just have a little break from your teammates, that is a potential strategy that could yield benefits over the long term.
Yeah, if for no other reason other than to reduce the opportunities for crew conflict. If you're awake for a shorter period of time, there's less opportunity for you to start bickering with crew or start bickering with mission control. Just even, less opportunities. And it's also, you're stuck in a tin can for months on end with nowhere to go. We don't really know what kind of psychological burden the crew will have for that. So being able to, shut off your mind and, restore your energy and get some sleep, while also kind of not dealing with worrying about that, is another way to help improve potential psychological burden of space travel.
And I'd like to follow up on another statement. You had mentioned, Kate, that we don't necessarily have to drop the temperature for an individual by an excessive amount, maybe 1 degree C or a few degrees Celsius, and that can have a dramatic impact on the resources that we need to take with us on these long duration missions. So can you both talk about the reasonable expectations for what metabolic manipulation, after getting across all the barriers to developing the technology, what is the reasonable expectations for implementation aboard, say, a craft during a long duration mission?
I guess I think, without getting too much into the engineering side, which clearly I'm not, I really think that implementation is going to be limited by what the spacecraft looks like. We're really concerned about mass, power, volume constraints for long duration missions, right? We're talking about metabolic manipulation, reducing risk factors associated with how much groceries do we need to bring to go to Mars. So I think it's I don't know if less likely is the right thing to say, but it would certainly behoove us to create solutions that do not require heavy, large, power-hungry, fancy instrumentation to achieve. So implementation, I think, is going to look as much like what the spacecraft has on it as possible.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, going back to, the sci-fi example, and also, nature, where bears will hibernate for months on end. I don't think that humans are going to hibernate for months on end. I think it'll be more so in the duration of periods of days, where they're, sleeping or just, prolonging the amount of time that they're asleep. Like what our current research does is we almost reverse the amount of time that they're awake versus asleep. So they're asleep for 20 hours and awake for 4. So even then, that creates a shorter period during each day where they can deal with, the isolation and confinement, crew conflict. And then there's that opportunity to eat, exercise, and then go back to sleep. This isn't going to be where they just lay there for 9 months straight because you worry about bed sores and things like that. It'll be more so of a prolonged sleep or sleeping for a couple of days at a time.
Yeah, and I think what we know about animals and hibernation supports that plan. We don't yet completely understand why animals wake up from hibernation. The environment certainly plays a role, but animals are accumulating, metabolic byproducts and depleting metabolic energy sources over the course of a torpor bout or a hibernation season. And until we really know all of those things, I don't think there's any it's a real far future plan to think about trying to implement something really long duration like that in a human.
So in other words, as was mentioned earlier, the pod reality or perception is, even though idyllic perhaps in sci-fi, is just not the reality that would be faced.
Hey, it's a good goal. Especially if it could serve multiple purposes on the spacecraft. But yeah, I think that's a far future goal.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it would also have a lot of terrestrial applications, thinking about patients who are undergoing prolonged bed rest, just for, bed sores and things like that they would have to, that would help answer a lot of those questions. But yeah, unfortunately, I don't think that the pods are in the future.
Actually, that brings up another question. One of the things that I think is fantastic about, TRISH and biomedical research institutes who are focused on improving human health on Earth as well as in space. But what applications does metabolic manipulation currently have regarding how we care for our patients here on the ground?
Yeah, absolutely. So our line of research actually stemmed from therapeutic hypothermia, which is a protocol used in cardiac arrest patients. If you sedate them and cool them, it improves neurologic outcomes. We thought that it could be beneficial to do in other patient populations, like stroke patients or traumatic brain injured patients. But we're not able to fully sedate those patients because we need to do serial neurologic exams. So this whole line of research started with trying to figure out a way that we could lower temperature and reduce metabolism in other patient populations that we couldn't completely sedate. Because otherwise, if you don't sedate someone, they shiver and then they are very mad at you. So we were working with that line of research, but there's also more prolonged bed rest, chemotherapy patients who are sitting in a chair for hours at a time. Also thinking about battlefield triage or a disabled submarine. Those are other kinds of applications that we can use this metabolic manipulation beyond space flight.
Yeah, I'll just second that concept of remote medicine, which is relevant to various parts of the world. If we can learn better how to stabilize patients for transport to definitive care, I think that could touch a lot of lives.
Yeah, especially if you get into rural medicine when it's not 7 minutes for an ambulance to arrive, it could be 7 hours if you're in the middle of nowhere, Alaska. And if you can slow their metabolism enough and to just buy time, that can significantly impact their outcome.
Yes, or even if it's days, if you're in a fly-in location and the weather turns poor.
So I'm going to go back to another comment that was made because I think I think that the risks to human health in space, people are at this point now very familiar with microgravity. We don't really have evolutionary adaptations to microgravity, and so there's bone loss and cardiac dysfunction and a number of other complications that can occur. But space radiation outside of low Earth orbit, in which astronauts are going to be irradiated with charged particles emitted from stars as they go supernova, is pretty concerning, especially when you get to a place like Mars, in which there's no magnetic field for protection, really. And so, it was mentioned that metabolic manipulation could serve a radioprotective role. Can you expand upon that? Because I think that that's an important consideration that a lot of people have questions about.
Kind of.
Take that one.
I can kind of expand. I knew this was going to be the first question. I just knew it. No, so I think we're going to know a lot more about those mechanisms soon because there is some really cool mechanistic type research that is really just getting going now. I don't think we entirely know. And I know there's some hibernation people in the attendees who might disagree with how much we know, but I think we're still getting there. What we know is that if you irradiate animals while they are cold, while they are hibernating, they survive better. And there's some nuances to exactly what temperature regimes make survival the best. And so temperature clearly plays a role. If you can reduce cellular processes through cooling, that appears to be protective. I think we still need to look more into the role of DNA damage repair mechanisms that might be important in hibernators naturally occurring at an enhanced rate that could also be protective. But it's some combination of those factors. So what we know is that you dose a squirrel with radiation while it's hibernating, and it does a whole lot better than if you do the same thing to a mouse.
Yeah, exactly. And it'll be interesting. There is a NIAC grant out that is funded a hibernation pod so that we can actually send hibernating animals into space because we haven't seen that yet. So we could send a squirrel into space and maybe it just completely disrupts their hibernation pattern. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that we wouldn't be able to hibernate as humans, but that creates a whole nother line of questions of hibernation and what kind of protective factors it could have for humans.
Yeah, and getting back to the comment that Jeff made as well about coming from the bone and muscle atrophy stage, we know that these animals are protected. They don't lose bone and muscle quite as much as we would just predict if you were just hanging out, not doing bed rest for the equivalent amount. But we don't really know what that looks like in microgravity, if that's exactly going to be the same. So seeing how that works in these organisms would be really illuminating.
Yeah, and what we need to remember is if just because it doesn't work in one species of animals doesn't mean that it won't work in another species. The flavor of hibernation or torpor amongst those animals that undergo that planned metabolic reduction, it varies. So, just because it doesn't work in one doesn't mean that it wouldn't work in another, and it wouldn't be informative to test it among many animals, mice, rats, ground squirrels, etc.
Absolutely.
Yeah, actually, that brings up another question. So some animals hibernate, and other animals do not.
Mhm.
Is there some sort of, do all animals have the capability of hibernation within their genome? And is it sort of environmentally controlled? Or is there another sort of biologic reason why some do, some do not, in general?
I feel like, and Allyson, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I feel like this is the great debate at the international hibernation conferences. I think that rats don't naturally hibernate, but you can like through their hypothalamus, you can force them to undergo hibernation. So I would imagine that there is a whole line of other animals that you can kind of unlock that capability of hibernating, whether it's through their genes or just a physiologic pathway that's to be determined. Yeah, Allyson, do you want to correct me if I was super wrong on that, since I'm new to animal hibernation?
You're not super wrong. It is a debate. I think we could rewind it a little bit and just say that every mammal is capable of some degree of metabolic variation. We reduce our metabolism and our body temperature when we sleep. Every animal does that. Certainly the ancestral mammal didn't have a super stable high body temperature. Body temperature and metabolic fluctuation is part of what we are. Now, some species have really gone to an extreme of control of metabolism. And I think there's a lot that we can learn from that, especially in terms of what do we need to have on board to minimize any risks associated with reducing metabolism in humans. But we're capable of it, at least at some level. What would be ideal, I think, is to try to just push our already existing potential a little further, a little longer.
Agreed.
So you just mentioned actually, we there's some work to do so that we can minimize the risks to reducing metabolism in humans. What are the potential risks to human health that would be faced caused by reducing metabolism and metabolic manipulation during long duration spaceflight or here on the ground?
Yeah, so similar to prolonged bed rest that hospital patients experience, a decline in muscle health and bone health. We don't yet know how reduced metabolism impacts those. We hope that our protocol, we haven't been able to analyze the data yet, but we're hoping that we're going to see some muscle sparing in our participants that undergo metabolic manipulation compared to what you would see in an ICU or someone who is injured and at home on bed rest. And also, that also takes into consideration bone density as well, and what that does to your cardiovascular system as well. Bears and hibernating animals in general are able to spare those systems. Unclear if we're able to do that in humans as well.
I think also from the animal side, we can think about rewarming from being cold and being metabolically depressed is a bit of a stress on the system. So being able to rewarm humans, we have a lot of experience doing this clinically with hypothermia patients. There's an order in which you want to rewarm a patient so that you're not flooding the core with with cold blood really quickly. So changing, if we can kind of mimic how animals rewarm from the core out, or strategies like that, I think those are potentially useful in minimizing risks. I think as you turn metabolism back up, you potentially get a couple of mismatches in metabolic products that can be harmful, like free radical stress, I think is a big one that I think about. So maybe do we need to be giving our patients on long duration space missions extra antioxidants, more blueberries, in order to try to keep antioxidants high to reduce the possibility of that type of damage? I think there's a couple of those strategies that we can recapitulate for humans.
Yeah, and realistically, human hibernation or metabolic manipulation is going to be aided with drugs or pharmaceuticals of some kind. So you have to take into consideration what those risks are. Some sedatives you do not see sleep architecture in an EEG. Others, like dexmedetomidine, there is evidence that suggests that maybe you do see some sleep architecture. So how does that impact their sleep? Some medications can have addictive properties, others not so much. But if they're taking it for a couple of days at a time, are they going to go through like a withdrawal period from that as well? So those are all other things that you need to consider.
Are there any, mentioning things like elevated oxidative stress and the potential need to do, combined therapeutics to minimize some of the potential risks with metabolic manipulation? Are there any current studies, whether, ground-based, animal culture, or human clinical trials that do combine, say, factors like antioxidants with metabolic manipulation to see if it can improve outcomes?
Not that I know of in humans. I know that the next line after our protocol is considering, how do diet and exercise impact our ability to reduce metabolism for prolonged periods. But I'm not sure if, Allyson, you have seen anything in the animal literature.
I think people are working in this space. The specific examples I can think of in animal and then in translational projects are focused on inducing hibernation more than arising from it. So I'm not sure that I have an exact answer, but I do think there's work that's happening in this space, and I think we will be learning a lot in the near future.
Yeah, there's also Marie Morteau looking at nutraceuticals in hind limb suspension in rats, but that doesn't include hibernation. But that's the closest that I'm aware of.
Okay. Kind of along those lines, is there a specific, and this is coming from the Q&A right now, is there any sort of genetic signature that can be used to identify hibernation states? In other words, are there, has anyone really looked into global gene profiling in hibernating animals? Because some of the work that's come back from some of the studies of human in space clearly identify that there can be some genetic changes that occur to astronauts during spaceflight.
Yes, that has extensively been done in many species of hibernator. Absolutely. Can you use that to see a signature of hibernation? Sort of. You see exactly what you would expect with metabolism turned down. You see some remodeling of the mitochondria. You see changes in metabolic pathways, because these animals are also not eating while they're hibernating. So they're switching their metabolism to use their energy stores in their body fat. You see a lot of those. Those signals are really clear. I think what we're still trying to completely unravel is the cues and the regulation that needs to happen to get you from one state to another. And now in humans, that's not really a requirement. We don't have to do a gene therapy that's going to turn you into a hibernator and then reverse it to have you come out. We can do a lot of this with pharmaceuticals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I hope that the ability to use pharmaceuticals also helps with, so it's my understanding that hibernating animals, they will periodically go into and out of hibernation every couple of weeks to sleep, because they don't sleep when they hibernate. But it's also very dangerous to come out of this hibernation. So by being able to induce and wake individuals up pharmaceutically, hopefully that will also make it easier on the humans to go into and out of this metabolic manipulation period.
So again, kind of going back to the basics of metabolic manipulation and definitions of hibernation and torpor. What I'm hearing here is that hibernation does not necessarily equals sleep. So in other words, it can just be lowering of the metabolic rate enough, which could then potentially be a strategy. So when we're talking about metabolic manipulation of astronauts during spaceflight, as you mentioned, it could be lowering the body temperature enough where the metabolic rate is reduced, but we don't actually see the astronauts going into sort of a state of sleep. Is that correct?
In theory, yeah. Yeah, even just suppressing like the cold-induced thermogenesis could be beneficial. So it's metabolically expensive to maintain your body temperature. And so when you're in a cold environment, your body's thermostat goes on overdrive to try to compensate and maintain its homeostasis. Even if you could just turn that off and keep them cooler to reduce their metabolism a little bit, on top of preventing that shivering, that cold-induced thermogenesis, that could be enough even to just save 5 or 10% of metabolic use for that day, which again, when you're worrying about groceries for 9 months in a very small vessel, that adds up.
Yeah, it will depend, I think, also on what temperatures we think we can target for humans, because your brain doesn't sleep when it's sufficiently cold. It has to be warm enough to actually do sleep. So if we're really driving temperature down fairly low, which has a lot more risks than being in this close to our regular body temperature, just depressed a little bit, those things are going to make a difference.
Yeah, even just a degree Celsius, going from 37 to 36 in our research, that's where we see the most bang for our buck. That's where we get the most metabolic savings. And then as you try to go down from 36 to 35 to 34, you have to work harder to get less metabolic savings. And then you run into the risk of arrhythmias and other problems. So is it even worth doing anything more than just a mild temperature reduction?
Yeah, and we're finding the same in our hibernating ground squirrels. We're not changing hibernation temperatures by 1 degree. We're doing steps that are a little bit bigger than that because they can hibernate all the way down to near freezing. But you get the biggest savings really quickly, and you get the least disruption of metabolic pathways and gene pathways. So that might be the place to look first for humans.
So it really looks like there's a certain range in which too high and you end up with arrhythmias, lack of sleep, which could definitely be a source of risk to human health during spaceflight if they do have altered circadian rhythms or impaired sleeping. But you can't go too low, or else then you don't get the benefits of the metabolic manipulation. So in other words, the current state of the research is finding, at least in rodent models, but also in humans, what is the sort of drop in temperature in which you get the most benefit.
And that's going to depend a lot on what our strategy is for long duration space travel. Like, do we want to are we trying to figure out how to bring fewer groceries, or do we want to bring no groceries? And those are definitely questions for some of the mission planners and the engineers to figure out where this dialogue goes for the near future and then the far future.
Yeah, exactly. And the thought, the thought with sleep, is, compared to when you sleep, even just laying on the couch, binge watching Netflix, your metabolism is higher when you're watching TV than when you're asleep. So just increasing the amount of time that they're asleep is just another method to compound that metabolic savings. You don't necessarily have to do that. But again, since they're not going to go to Mars in a vessel the size of the International Space Station, they're not going to have as many research studies to do to occupy their time. So, that's another opportunity to reduce that psychological burden.
Speaking of like psychological burdens and neurocognitive effects, I think right now one of the big concerns are issues related to cognitive dysfunction that potentially occur during spaceflight. Is there any evidence that dropping the metabolic rate, even by dropping body temperature by 1 degree or so, could have benefits regarding cognition?
Not that I'm aware of in humans. I mean, we are collecting cognitive data on our participants to track that, but I have not seen a whole lot of research for it in humans.
I don't know. That's a good question. That's definitely something that we should figure out.
I guess like if you train a 13-line ground squirrel to go through a maze, are they better or worse at it before or after hibernation?
So I haven't done this study, but a colleague of mine has, and over a drink, we were discussing this, and this is how the results of the study were explained to me. So you do this, that you train them to do a maze, they hibernate, you see, they wake up, you see if they can still do the maze. Some ground squirrels are rock stars, some ground squirrels are rocks. They were terrible at the maze before, they were still terrible at the maze after. The good ones were still good after hibernation. So there's a lot of biological variation that we should also consider when we're thinking about strategies that are going to be applied to human space travelers.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a phenotype of humans who are better at dealing with reduced temperature. You know, some people shiver right out of a protocol from our earlier studies. Other individuals, they just sit there and they're cool as cucumbers and their temperature sinks like a rock. We're not sure necessarily what it is that makes some people not as tolerant to it than others. So those are other things to consider whenever you're choosing your flight crew.
Now, I'm aware that there is I believe, a cave in France, I think it's in France, that has bones from human ancestors, hominins, and many different species of hominins, I believe. And there is evidence that there were hibernating hominins that come from that particular cave. Can you share your thoughts on whether or not humans at any point in time in our evolutionary history, or even now, have the capability of hibernating?
Why not?
Yeah,
The bones.
I wouldn't be surprised.
There's other primates that hibernate.
Which ones?
There's a number of tropical primates like lemurs that hibernate.
Yeah, the fat-tailed lemur.
Yeah, fat-tailed dwarf lemurs, gray dwarf lemurs. There are a couple of tenrecs. Those are like, think hedgehog from Madagascar kind of deal that hibernate. Those are not primates, but like there are a number of tropical primates that hibernate.
So what's the stimulus, help me here, that will induce hibernation in some of these related taxa to us?
Resource scarcity.
Yeah,
Right,
or variation in the environment, I think, is the big cue. There's certainly a lot of organisms are cued by changes in photoperiod, but that doesn't work if you live at the equator. That's only probably a derived feature of high latitude North American hibernators, where we have really big changes in day length. But environmental variation is probably what does it.
Do you think it's possible to, say, genetically engineer a species to permit them to hibernate? Or is it more something that can be induced, you think, by environmental conditions or other stimuli? In other words, they already have the machinery there to hibernate versus genetically engineer them to do it.
I think the machinery is not there anymore in most species that don't hibernate. That would be my guess. That's just me guessing.
Really? Even though you can force a rat to hibernate, they're not impacting their genes whenever they do that. They're activating something in the hypothalamus, correct?
Yeah, so I think you can induce something to hibernate, but you want sort of, I was thinking about the question, like to have an organism do it. Like I think the machinery, partly the cues, and then the drivers, the mechanisms to actually get into hibernation naturally are, I bet there's versions of that gene programming is there, but it's just maybe just broken or just a little bit offset in these species that can't do it. But I think pharmacologically, yes, that still reduce metabolism.
Yeah, and evolutionarily, it's just not relevant to them anymore, too.
Right.
Just kind of forgotten gene activation.
So that's interesting. It seems, so for me, this is fascinating for many reasons, but one is that there's a lot of questions. I mean, certainly considerations for this, in terms of inducing hibernation and metabolic manipulation, but then also once the metabolism has been altered, how is that going to affect sort of performance and how, say, astronauts are treated? Like, for instance, if an astronaut is undergoing metabolic manipulation in space, what protocols would need to be changed in terms of medication administration or their daily activities and so on and so forth. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, certainly for complicating the treatment profile for an astronaut, that the onboard pharmacy is always a big discussion topic, right? Because what do you need, right? You need to have everything that you're going to need, and it needs to not expire.
Yeah.
All the way there and all the way back, right? So I think if you're complicating that scenario, then that's definitely something to consider. I kind of think, I think a lot of these discussions are going to help us figure out where we want to come together to try to address this really complicated situation. And perhaps I could suggest it needs to be led by the goals of the mission and from the engineering side. I think hibernation is so broad. There's so many different ways that it manifests in the world, and even in humans. I think we need to sort of circle around a target therapeutically, a temperature, a time, a duration, that kind of thing that will help us pick apart.
Yeah. Exactly. And then for space specifically, I mean, ultimately, we're looking at crew performance, their optimization, and also, the environmental control and the life support systems. So even so much as thinking about what kind of exercise strategy can we utilize? As an exercise physiologist, my goal is to always, get people to get more muscle and turn up their metabolism. But what kind of exercise protocol can I create that creates no change at all whatsoever and uses the smallest amount of calories to perform that exercise? And also, how much do they sweat during that protocol? We have to take that into consideration for all of these things. And then nutrition, is there a diet strategy from the thermogenic effects of food that changes their metabolism in our favor? All of these go into these life support systems. Does your diet, and again, your exercise will obviously impact how much oxygen you need and also how much carbon dioxide you're excreting. So how can we tinker with their daily activities and their nutrition to further compound that metabolic savings?
So there really needs to be discussions with the engineers, with the craft, and the biologists and the scientists who are performing these related studies. I think because there's a lot of concerns, like, you mentioned exercise and what are the exercise protocols that can be used while under metabolic manipulation. But unfortunately, for right now, my understanding is that there's not going to be the space for something like the advanced resistive exercise device, which could fundamentally alter, things like bone preservation and muscle preservation. And now you throw in then the effects of metabolic manipulation. So it sounds to me like both of you are saying it's essential that we have all of these elements who are working with astronaut nutrition and, exercise, working together, with metabolic researchers, metabolic manipulation and in other fields, so that we can just get it right.
Yeah, I mean, this isn't something that you want to just tinker around with. This is people's lives, and this is a plan for going to Mars, and we want to mitigate the risk as early as possible. And using the lunar surface as a test bed is a great starting place as well.
Yeah, I think this is definitely a place where one group could have a great idea, and then we realize a little bit farther down the road that there's a roadblock for another group. Like from an engineering perspective, we simply cannot do that. We cannot put that on the spacecraft. Or from a human medical perspective, we simply cannot drug that. Like we cannot bring that drug with us in space. So that's the end of this, line of inquiry. So I think having these conversations really early is going to make a big difference and potentially could help even in the short term. It's not a big risk factor with the current ISS mission, but there is always the possibility, and with Lunar Gateway and Artemis, that something might happen with a spacecraft and it becomes disabled. And in a scenario where there's like a rescue mission that's mounted, that crew is in space for longer with their original resources than planned. So this being able to kind of just turn down the flame a little bit extends the possibility of intervening in some scenarios, or getting a crew member back to Earth who's been injured, on a 3-day return potentially from Gateway. This could be really relevant really soon.
Yeah, so it's not necessarily something that's just for Mars. It can be utilized as an emergency strategy, like for the Navy if their CO2 scrubbers go down. So if the ISS, if their CO2 scrubbers go down, if they're disabled, or just one, just doing a little bit of savings until they can be repaired, or until things can be sent up to help replace it.
There's been a number of individuals in the Q&A, I've noticed this, that have asked this question, and I'm intrigued by it as well, simply because, for our patients, we notice that yoga is something that has potential for improving their quality of life and treatment responses. But has yoga been explored as a means of reducing metabolism and affecting metabolic, manipulating the metabolism?
Yeah, I'm familiar with a couple of studies from the 70s that investigated this, and I feel certain that there must be other more modern looks at this. But it's really cool. Even early on, you see body temperature and metabolic depression in meditation. And the study that I'm thinking of took untrained Westerners and even showed that it was possible in that group. However, highly trained yogis were much better at it.
Mm-hmm.
So there's definitely potential there.
Yeah, that's a whole, I feel like that's a whole nother field of research to get into, not just for space flight, but also for the medical field too. If you have a patient on prolonged bed rest, can training them to do this mindfulness, this meditation, help them get through the fact that they are stuck in bed for months on end, or they are undergoing chemotherapy for hours on end, and how does that impact their outcomes as well?
But yeah, just even to underscore a point that was made earlier, that humans are capable of metabolic manipulation in sleep, in meditation. It's there. We're not great at it. And so, maybe pharmacologically we can push it a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, with that, we're almost at time. I just want to give our panelists an opportunity to just tell us final thoughts about the state of the field, metabolic manipulation, so if you would, please go ahead, Allyson.
I think that these conversations are what's going to drive this field forward. I think that bringing folks together to talk about where we should be aiming, there's a lot, we need a lot of pieces, and we just need to put the pieces together in some way. And I think we're really close to that. I'm pretty optimistic about the future.
Yeah, I agree. And thank you very much for inviting us to talk about this. I feel like a couple of years ago, I would just go to a conference and, even though we had the funding, people would say, oh, you can't do that. Well, we have papers out. We are doing this. We need to have these conversations because there is some benefit here. And if we put more people's brains together to brainstorm, which the space community is pretty darn good at, I think that we can move this faster, move this along faster to implement it and do so in a safe and effective way, not just for spaceflight, but terrestrially as well. Yeah, and more open conversations. I'm terrible at trying to explain this to engineers. I need to get better at understanding what their stops are, what questions they have for our work as well.
Well, with that, I got to say, I thought you explained it very well to this engineer, and I really appreciate both of your explanations today, because I had a lot of questions. A lot of these things really came, I mean, I fully did not understand really the difference. I thought hibernation equals sleep. So it's really good to know the state of the science, what hibernation really is, and the benefits of not only metabolic manipulation, but the work that you are all doing to advance this field. So I want to thank you both, Kate and Allyson, for serving as the expert panelists today. We all really appreciate it. TRISH, as well as the attendees, I'm sure, have really benefited a lot from this. And I'd like to thank all the attendees for joining and ask all of you to, one, if you're interested in the TRISH postdoctoral fellowship, please check that out. Two, keep your eyes open for the next TRISH Orbit Rendezvous. And with that, we will go ahead and close this meeting. So thank you all, and thank you to our panelists, and we'll see you at the next one.